Welcome to Talk Energy Week Speaker Series Forum for everyone in the room and everybody tuning in across the country. Bienvenue au webinaire au Musée de l'Aviation et de l'Espace du Canada aujourd'hui où nous parlerons de l'avenir énergétique du Canada. It's great to have you with us here today. Those of you that are in Ottawa that could brave the weather and around the country, we hope it's a little bit nicer than it is in the nation's capital today. My name's Alex Benet and I'm the President and CEO of the Canada Science and Technology Museums Corporation, and Jason Armstrong over here and his colleagues at our Let's Talk Energy initiative put on Talk Energy Week, the speaker series forum for us here today. So shortly, Jason's going to let you know how the next hour is going to proceed. But first, I've been asked to set the scene. So day to day, most of us here in Canada take energy for granted. We have plenty of energy to heat our homes, plenty of energy to heat our cars. We have energy to run our household lights and appliances. In fact, electrical energy is so available that we could recharge our phones pretty much anywhere. I do appreciate you guys not being on your phones today, so thank you for that. And we all know how important that is, obviously, to the cell phones in our lives. I've often been accused myself of spending too much time on my own device. So energy, however, comes in many forms. So whether it's petroleum, natural gas, biofuels, electricity generated from hydro, from nuclear. And some of these energy sources are easier to obtain than others, obviously, and some are a lot cleaner. Some are more expensive and some are cheaper. The energy scene is a complex one and it can have a whole bunch of widespread impacts. And just look at the effects that low petroleum prices are having to our fellow Canadians in Alberta and Newfoundland at the moment. Then there's discussions around energy pipelines, the effects of fossil fuels on the environment, locally and globally, as well as what it will take for our society to move from non-renewable energy sources to renewable ones. Some of these questions have simple answers, some have complicated answers, and there are even creative answers, I've been told. So we could laugh at this image if we want, but it shows that we really do need to understand energy. And that's why we're here today, assuming everybody is starting off from a little bit further ahead in the knowledge curve than this particular individual. So to talk about and better understand energy and its importance to our everyday lives, and to encourage all Canadians to do the same, the better we all understand energy and its complexities, the better choices we're going to make today for a prosperous and sustainable future. So speaking of energy, this is our third Talk Energy Week, and it's been gaining a lot of momentum year over year. You're here in the theater, and those of you who are with us online as part of a much broader audience across the country, there's a lot of activities taking place across Canada this week, and in fact, we've already had thousands of students like you in Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Quebec, and Ontario discussing a whole bunch of energy questions and trying to solve complicated problems for the future of this country and the world. So tomorrow and Friday, discussions like the ones that you're going to see here take place today are going to take place in the Western provinces and Northern territories. Donc, je vous remercie de vous joindre à nous aujourd'hui. Commençons la conversation. Thank you for being here today, and let's get the conversation started. So on that note, I'd like to turn it over to Jason Armstrong.
Thanks, Alex, for setting the stage. So we're going to be doing some presentations. We have three people here who are going to share their expertise. Then we're going to have a chance for people to ask questions, and that's both for people here in the studio as well as people who are tuning in on the YouTube channel. So you can either ask questions via Twitter or the YouTube or through our Facebook page. I'll introduce our three speakers and then we'll get started right away. We have Kai Lim Kwan is a trade economics specialist training at the University of Ottawa with a background in environmental policy and African economic history. She's interested in how energy trade is linked to economic development and to climate change. We have Eric Cascala, who holds a bachelor's degree in public administration and political science from the University of Ottawa. Eric's a strong supporter of development of Canada's oil and gas sector, and he currently works at a public affairs firm in Ottawa. And finally, we have Lauren Touchant, a PhD candidate at the University of Ottawa. Her research interests are environmental and energy policy, crisis management, and social policy. Her thesis is focused on local energy and environmental governance in Canada and in the United States. And so without any further ado, I'm going to invite Kai up to the mic and to present to us.
Okay, so this is working. Perfect. Okay, so this is Thomas Malthus. Who's ever heard of this guy? Perfect. Geography 12? Okay, so in 1798, he predicted that we were all doomed. Doomed in the sense that we would never escape this medieval subsistence level of poverty where we would constantly fear the next Black Plague. So, why was Malthus such a downer? And do you remember seeing this too, the Malthusian trap? So historically, the population has grown exponentially while natural resources grew at a linear pace. So as a consequence, Malthus wrote, under his candlelight of course, that human beings were trapped in this state of perpetual poverty because limited natural resources would be shared amongst an ever-growing population. But this was only true until the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So the first railway journey of the coal-fired steam locomotive, which took place on February 21st, 1804 in Britain, signaled that we would break free from this Malthusian trap. Now, fast forward to 2014. What happened in 2014 in Ontario? Ontario phased out coal from its power mix, and the world cheered because so far it's been the single measure that's been single largest greenhouse gas reduction measure in North America. So that's huge, right? We should be proud of Ontario. But wait a second, wasn't coal the hero that got us out of this Malthusian trap? So if then, why is coal seen as this supervillain at these international climate change conferences? And why was Ontario so excited to get rid of coal from its power mix? So to grapple with this paradox, I want to share 10 pictures in the next 7 minutes or so. Okay, the first one. Okay, this is the world annual coal consumption starting from 1820. So just remember the shape of this curve, the J-shaped, okay? Next one. This is GDP per capita. Recall, GDP is the total goods and services produced within an economy divided by the population. And the red line, that's Britain's GDP per capita from 1500 to 1950. So remarkably, pretty much the same shape as this one. So more generally, we can establish a strong correlation, so how the lines move together between economic growth and energy use. And that has largely to do with the industrialization process. And so let me now introduce you to another economist. His name was Walter Rostow. In 1960, he was looking at all these developed countries, and back then they were called first world countries in the Cold War lingo. And he figured out, okay, so there's a secret to economic growth. All these rich countries, they transitioned from being an agrarian economy, where agriculture takes up most of the GDP of the country, into an industrialized society where manufacturing took up most of the share of the GDP. So, what that meant, okay, sorry, I lost that thought. Okay. All right, so during the Industrial Revolution, machines replace human labor, and fossil fuels replace natural energies such as animal power, water, and wind. And among different sources of fossil fuels, it was coal that was the cheapest and most abundant. And really, the importance of coal can't be overemphasized. And for example, another economist, his name is Kenneth Pomeranz, he thought that Industrial Revolution started in Britain because there was abundant access to coal reserves near population centers. So he argued that's why Industrial Revolution started in Britain and not China. And other economic historians like David Landis and Phyllis Diane, they even define Industrial Revolution as switch to coal from other sources of natural energy. But coal sees its eventual downfall. So we haven't talked about the third brown line, that's the CO2 emissions, right? And I'm sure you're all familiar with the fact that burning fossil fuel emits other greenhouse gases, and amongst them, carbon dioxide. But we've known that burning coal is associated with an environmental cost for a while. I mean, so beginning in 1873, there were a number of killer fogs in London that killed over 1,000 people within 2 to 3 days. And if you go to, this is a picture of Beijing. So you're not going to see sun in Beijing, and that's because in Beijing, in China, 74% of its electricity comes from coal-fired power plants. And just last year, the government approved 155 more coal power plants, and that's going to end up adding about 166 million carbon to CO2 equivalent into the air, and that's equal to an annual emission of Brazil. So speaking of CO2, which is the culprit of climate change, last December in Paris, the world leaders agreed that we have to do something about climate change. And if we're serious about it, and if we're serious about keeping the global temperature rising, capping it at 2 degrees Celsius pre-industrial level, that actually means we only have 1,000 gigaton of CO2. So we call it carbon budget according to this unburnable carbon thesis that was put forward first by this think tank in Britain called Carbon Tracker. And so we have 1,000 gigatons of CO2 to burn by 2050, but we've already used half of it. And that means we can't burn 2/3 of world's proven reserves. And the dilemma doesn't end there, right? Because if you can see, in 1965, the developed countries had access to 70% of primary sources of energy. And because access to energy is so closely linked to economic growth, there are still 1.3 billion people without access to electricity around the world, and 95% of those people are in sub-Saharan Africa. And you can see that Africa throughout the last 4 decades had very little access to energy. And also you have people in Southeast Asia, for example, 22% of the population, that's around 134 million people, they don't have access to electricity. So what they do? So all this discussion, it sets me up to introduce you this concept of energy trilemma. Because all these issues are so complex, we need a framework to think about it. So energy trilemma asks you, sorry, I have too many things in one hand. So energy trilemma basically asks you, can the world have access to secure, affordable, and equitable energy services that are environmentally benign? So those are a lot of complex words. So basically, can developing countries, can they have access to cheap and abundant and reliable supply of energy to grow? And can they ensure that that growth is environmentally sustainable? Well, this is called a trilemma because it's really difficult to resolve different and because these objectives actually conflict with each other. And that has to do with the concept of trade-off. Economists love the concept of trade-off because it basically says that you always have to give up something to earn something. So in the context of energy sources, so let's take oil for example. So since the 2 OPEC crisis in the 70s, oil is regarded as not very secure source of energy from the importing country's perspective. And until mid-2014, which is when the oil prices started nosediving and along went loony, oil was considered as an expensive source and which it hit its peak at $110 per barrel. And the coal, we've been talking about coal, it has, in terms of its carbon intensity, it has the highest carbon intensity, but has the lowest levelized cost of electricity. And we can't forget about the renewables, right? Because in the past 5 years or so, the solar PV has dramatically decreased in cost, but it still has problems with intermittency, grid connection, and scalability. So in this context, what do developing countries do? And let's take, all right. This is a projection from the International Energy Agency. And because from now until 2035, Southeast Asia is going to increase its energy demand by 80%. And because they're running out of their indigenous sources of natural gas, and as I said before, 134 million people don't have access to electricity. So what do? They're going to triple their coal use. And so, unlike Malthus, I'm not going to end my talk with doom and gloom of coal, once a hero turning into a villain, defeating us in the fight against climate change. Because I want to remind you two things, actually three things. The first is that economic growth and energy use, it's a two-way street, right? So countries needed to burn fossil fuel to get to where they are. But as countries got richer, we've noticed two things. The first is the evolution of power mix in Ontario. The first is that richer countries can afford to substitute more emissions-intensive sources like coal with less emissions-intensive sources like natural gas or renewable energy. And the second is that some countries have actually successfully decoupled their economic growth from emissions. So a great example would be Sweden, Denmark, and we have a fantastic homegrown example of British Columbia. So since implementing the carbon tax in 2008, they've been able to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by 10% by 2012 without impeding economic growth. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. And I want to leave you guys with some questions. So what does all this mean for Canada, right? And because Canada is such a major producer and supplier of world energy, what would decoupling of economic growth mean for Canada when energy sector accounts for 10% of our GDP? And second, as developing countries face this trilemma, what's the role of Canada, right? Do we need to help them transfer technology? Do we need to invest in them? Do we need to give them aid? And finally, is Malthus becoming relevant again? Because it seems that economic growth is going to be constrained by this planetary boundary of how much carbon we can emit. So I hope that these appear to be challenging but interesting questions, and I hope to continue the discussion and maybe see you at the Department of Economics at the University of Ottawa. Thank you. To introduce my colleague, this is Eric.
Hello, everyone. So again, thank you again for braving the elements and making it all the way out to this part of town. I know when I looked at the weather this morning, I was terrified. I thought we were going to be covered in a sheet of ice. Thankfully, that has not come yet, and we're all here. So I guess I just wanted to start my presentation off today by following up with my colleague and I guess showing you guys a brief video. So I believe if I click this button, it's going to come right on. So here it is, and it's going to be about a minute long, and we'll continue the discussion from here.
Ancient life on Earth. Over millions of years, plants and animals lived and died. That decomposed life sunk deep into the ground, and as a result, an ancient menace was created. Fossil fuels, black oil, coal, and gas have created modern society as we know it. This ancient sunlight, unleashed global industrial power on a scale never before witnessed in the history of the planet. But when burnt into the atmosphere, carbon causes climate change. 97% of climate scientists agree that climate change is happening now and is caused by human activity. However, the fossil fuel industry continues to pull that carbon out of the ground. They drill, they extract, making trillions of dollars. They frack, they mine, earning astronomical profits. We need to keep this carbon in the ground.
So that about wraps things up with that video here. So for those of you who don't know who narrated that, that was my good friend Leonardo DiCaprio. So he has said a number of things about Canada's energy sector over the past couple of years, a number of things that at least personally I've taken issue with. And so why I showed you that video today is it's not necessarily to dispute its claims per se. I think it does make some valid points that, for example, I do think climate change is certainly a major issue of concern and something that we do need to be worried about moving forward. But I think there's two areas of this video that I take serious issue with and would like to use to frame my presentation today. Because I think that video it did a good job of showing, I guess, one side of the debate about the energy sector, not only in Canada, but across the world. So the two things that I didn't really agree with was first his claim that we need to keep this carbon in the ground. I just, at this point in time, I don't really know if that's possible. And second, I also would like to dispute his portrayal of the energy industry. I don't know if it's fair to portray it as this big, giant, robotic monster just tearing money from the earth and eating it. I disagreed with that. So I guess I'll begin by talking about a statement on keeping carbon in the ground. Now, in theory, this does sound great in practice. We can just cut off fossil fuels completely, stop using it, completely switch over to clean technology. It sounds somewhat nice, but you might not realize it, but we rely on the fossil fuel industry and the oil and gas industry almost every single day. So when you turned your alarm clock to wake up in the morning, that alarm clock, there's products of fossil fuels in that. How you got to school, you probably got to school either you may have gotten a ride, you may have taken a bus. It's all directly connected to the fossil fuel industry. In addition, not only that, but if you have food on your table, if you have groceries, again, how those groceries get to the grocery store, how do you get home, that's all comes from burning fossil fuels. So we use this stuff almost every single day, yet we don't even realize it, and people often take it for granted. So going and saying, we need to keep this carbon in the ground, well, it sounds nice, but it's not necessarily going to work. And personally, at least I think, my friend Mr. DiCaprio, I don't know how much he would like that either, because let's see if I can get the next slide going here. So like that, for example, that's my friend Mr. DiCaprio, that's him sitting on his yacht. Now that yacht doesn't run on sunshine, that's run on fuel from the oil and gas industry. And then here's him getting onto his private jet, same thing. So he relies on this stuff all the time. And not only that, but I'm sure DiCaprio has a cell phone, I'm sure he has a computer, I'm sure he likes to eat. Everything he does, it's connected to the energy industry. So just imagine the life we would have today if we did not have, I guess, the oil and gas industry. I mean, imagine if your homes are heated by natural gas, for example. Imagine waking up in the middle of winter and realizing, oh, yeah, my house isn't heated, it's freezing cold. It just wouldn't work. So all this is to say, as easy as it is to criticize oil and gas, as easy as it is to criticize a lot of the energy sector, we're still relying on it. And now, in response to that, you might say, well, why don't we just switch completely to clean energy? Let's just do that. We'll create a clean economy and everything's going to be fine. But frankly, that's not as easy as it sounds. It's not something that can be done overnight. And also, even if it is something worth considering, again, I think you might be catching a theme here, it cannot be done without oil and gas. So when you think about it, something like a solar panel, for example, inside that solar panel is filled with copper. To get that copper, you need to mine. To mine that copper, you require heavy equipment, and naturally that heavy equipment is run on diesel fuel. So that's really the state of it. We need it for almost everything that we do. So I guess moving on from that, I want to move on to the second portion of that video that we saw, and that was the portrayal of the energy industry, the oil and gas industry, as this big monster that rips money out of the ground. That it's ruining everything is how a lot of people like to frame that discussion. I certainly disagree. I mean, right now it's probably not the best time economically with the low price of oil. I'm sure a lot of you guys are familiar with a lot of the debates around the pipelines, debates about oil and gas development in Canada. It might not look pretty, but the reality of it is that Canada's energy sector, it's what keeps our lights on in our schools, hospitals, businesses, and communities. It's the reason why I'm blinded up here with all these bright lights pointed at me right now. And not only that, it's us, like in 2014 alone, it invested $81 billion into the Canadian economy and paid more than $17 billion into the country's taxes. So that allowed for our governments to pay for our healthcare system, to pay for our education system, and many more of the services that it provides. And it is changing to some degree because of the low price of oil. It is making things a little bit more difficult. But at the same time, it is still there, and it is still an essential part of our economy, and it's going to continue to remain as an essential part of our economy. Canada is home to some of the largest oil reserves in the world, and these reserves are something that we have to take advantage of. And not only that, in Canada, 450,000 jobs exist today as a result of oil and gas. These 450,000 jobs, these are not something we can just take away. There are families that rely on this industry to put food on the table. And then it comes down to, I guess, the elephant in the room, which is climate change. Everybody talks about oil and gas, talks about the energy industry as these major emitters of greenhouse gases. But did you know that within the last 25 years, emissions from Canada's oil sands production has gone down by over 30%, and that oil and natural gas has invested over $1.3 billion into clean technology? Because the thing about the energy industry itself is when they're the ones, a lot of the time, they're the ones actually investing in these clean and green technologies that everybody likes to go and talk about. So I guess I just really wanted to talk about this today and say that I personally think it's really unfair to portray the energy sector in the way that it often is in Canada today. I'm sure you guys have heard a lot of the debates leveraged against it, a lot of the criticism, a lot of the negativity, but just remember that, again, it's what keeps things running in Canada, and it's going to be like that for the near future. I certainly think that there's a lot of potential in clean technology. And I think there's more we can do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But I also think that we do need to understand the reality of the Canadian economy today and kind of, I guess, have an appreciation for how things work. So I guess that will really conclude everything that I wanted to say today. So I hope that just after leaving this discussion, I hope that you'll at least look at this and remember it and just hear the other side of the argument. And when somebody talks about how, okay, pipelines are terrible, they're going to destroy our wildlife, destroy our nature, which in fact pipelines are incredibly safe, but that is not a debate I want to get into today. Just remember that the energy sector is actually something that is incredibly important to Canada, and something that's incredibly important to the Canadian economy, and something that gives us one of the highest standards of living in the world. And just keep in mind that without it, our lives would be very different. Thank you very much, and I will pass things on to my colleague Lauren now.
Okay. So let's look at more the political aspect of energy and sustainable development. I'm going to focus mostly on climate change, sustainable development, and energy right now. Okay. It's not working, the screen here. Oh, up here. Thank you. Okay. Oh, I'm doing it. Thank you. Okay. Yay. Getting there. Okay, so in capitalist societies today, the environment has long been portrayed under the new liberal economics, and it has been mostly defended that the free market will maximize social welfare and that natural resources are completely infinite. Unfortunately, it's not necessarily true. It has been proven during the 70s and 80s that a new thought kind of emerged, challenging this view. It entails that the economic development and the population growth actually constrain the Earth capacity. So this shift led to the emergence of what you probably heard as sustainable development, a paradigm that was published in 1987 by the United Nations in the publication Our Common Future, so-called the Brundtland Report. So this report emphasizes that natural ecosystems have finite capacities. The transition to sustainable system and renewable energy has to be quick, and we need to create greater equity, not only between the poor and the wealthy nations or poor and wealthy people, but also between generations. So we're talking about the next and future generations. So hopefully, yeah. So when we fast track to 2016, there were this whole debate about the oil sands, and we were talking a lot about fracking, but also about climate change. And there is this big fear of exceeding the 2 degrees Celsius. And if we continue business as usual, we might exceed the 4 degrees Celsius, which would be devastating for ecosystems and as well as a number of people in the world. And I'm thinking mostly of the Pacific Islands. So sustainable development is today more relevant than ever. So we're facing this energy dilemma, which is the idea of current inertia. What are we doing today is irreversible. There is also the other aspect that if we introduce new technologies, well, might take a long time. So for instance, when we talk about carbon capture and carbon storage, yes, we do have the technology, it's available, but it's not perfect. So if we improve it to a sufficient level, it might take maybe 2025, we're talking about putting it in place, and then it will take 2 decades actually to install carbon capture and then to be able to make a difference in terms of greenhouse gases emissions. There is also the aspect of actual realistic policies. When we talk about a target of 17% decrease of greenhouse gases emission under the 2005 levels, is it enough to not exceed a 2 degrees Celsius world temperature? I personally do not think so. So when we look at the inertia dilemma, it looks like that fossil fuel will remain the primary source of energy in Canada, even if there is a level of uncertainty, because we might invest suddenly into renewable energy, it might make a little difference, but also we're looking at the prices of gas right now and natural gases. So the consumption won't immediately decrease. Therefore, greenhouse gases emission will most likely remain slightly similar, maybe slightly decreased, but probably slightly increased by 2040. So who can ensure this prosperous and sustainable future? So I have a question for you, and my first question is, who is responsible for natural resources in Canada in terms of policy making? Is it the federal government? Please raise your hand and I'll be able to see who thinks that. Okay, no. The provincial government? Okay. Who thinks it's the municipal government? Who thinks it's all of them? Okay, really good. So originally, each provinces make laws related to natural resources, considering the exploration of non-renewable natural resources in the province, including development, conservation, management, and non-renewable resources, as well as forestry. However, in the past few years, we've seen the involvement of the federal government. The government has increased their talks about oil sands. They have increased advertising and strongly supported the Keystone XL pipeline. So the federal government is also involved with the National Energy Board, which is Canada's energy and safety regulator on pipelines and international power lines, imports of natural gas. So now, if I have a second question, who is responsible for natural resources in Canada? No, sorry, it's environment in Canada. So let's look at the environment mostly. Is it the federal government? Raise your hand if you think it's the federal government. Okay. Is it the provincial government? Is it the municipal government? All of them? Okay. Well, the responsibility is actually not really clear. The environment is not per se in the Constitution. However, the federal government is involved in environment through different portfolios. So I'm thinking of internal and external waters, sea coast, fisheries, national parks, navigation, international trades. There are other portfolios. We can think of national parks, if I didn't say it. We can think of agriculture as well. The province is actually does deal with environment with natural resources, public lands, property, provincial parks, local works, inland provincial areas. So in order to achieve significant greenhouse gases cuts, both levels of government have to work together because of their jurisdiction, but also because the environment, energy, involves sharing knowledge, policy, tools, skills, and practices. Environment, and energy are today in the what we call the intergovernmental agendas. It means it's on both or all of them agenda. But it's not enough because Canada actually needs an energy national policy. At the moment, we have no comprehensive policy at the national level. So, oops, can I go back? Here it is, okay. The problem is last year, all provinces met and they were not able to agree on a national energy policy. Why? It's because there was a clash between the provinces about first pipelines, so energy production, but also about emissions. So the diversity has just proven that right now a national energy policy is not down in the pipeline. The lack of cohesive policy encourages provinces to collaborate, and I don't know if you heard of it last year, but Kathleen Wynne in Ontario met with Philippe Couillard in Quebec, and they came up with the Ontario-Quebec Joint Initiative, which purpose is to trade electricity and collaborate in terms of climate change, water management, sustainable forestry. But the question is, once we have the federal and the provincial governments involved, are we not leaving out municipalities? So do you think we're leaving out municipalities? Do municipalities have a role to play? Who says yes? Who says no? Okay. They believe they should have a say. Why? Because of their responsibilities. They're responsible for bylaws, emergency disaster management, public transportation, municipal land use, water supply distribution, as well as waste management. They're also on the front line with citizens' belief and also with their well-being. And the third aspect is they believe there is a lack of leadership at the provincial and federal level. So right now, municipalities are actually working together to promote energy efficiency and climate change policies as well. At the international level, you probably heard of ICLEI. ICLEI is a network of municipalities. They met during the COP21 in Paris. They met actually in Mexico to talk about climate change. At the national level, you probably heard of the Partners for Climate Protection, which is an initiative from the Federal Canadian of Municipalities. Municipalities share knowledge and they work together to elaborate municipal planning. So for instance, the conference was actually 4 weeks ago. And in February 2016, the cities of Waterloo, the cities of Calgary and Toronto received an award for their energy planning. Waterloo plan of cutting off greenhouse gases emission by 6% from 2000 level by 2020, and Toronto plans to decrease greenhouse gases emission by 80% from 1990s level by 2050. So it leaves out the question is what role can community play today? Do you think communities, as being us together, individual, do have a say? Yes, community have to be on board. During the 2 last federal elections, polls revealed that environmental protection rounded in the top 5 of the most pressing issues in Canada. According to Focus Canada, which is a poll from the David Suzuki Foundation, 74% of Canadians say they believe, if it is possible, that the province shift to most energy efficiency, switching from fossil fuel to renewable energies such as wind power, solar power, and biofuels. Moreover, communities have a role to play in promoting renewable projects. In New Brunswick, for instance, right now, communities and First Nations are invited by the provincial government to invest into small hydro, wind power, and biomass generation. And New Brunswick Power is willing to buy the energy from the community, so some people can make some money out of it. There are many other examples in Canada, and I'm talking about the Okotoks project, for instance, in Alberta, which is a neighborhood composed of 52 houses. They are self-sustainable, and they produce right now 90% of their space and water heating on their own. If it seems that people are receptive to the renewable energy, There is experience in Canada and as well across the world that shows that renewable energy infrastructure are not always accepted. For instance, in Ontario, windmills have divided individuals, especially farmers, who saw that windmills kind of build up on their land and it decreased the value of their home. Also, there are many individuals arguing that it kind of spoils the landscape. It's a big machine in the middle of a very nice farmland, so it kind of turned down tourism and the beauty of the landscape. So it brings up a question, something we call social acceptance of energy projects. It's becoming more and more unavoidable because people believe they have a say in decision making. So companies do consult citizens before starting a project, and they see if people actually agree with the projects and what are their concerns. So individuals, then we have examples, for instance, of Aboriginal communities. Right now, so you can see, I have pictures of the Tahltan First Nations. They actually occupied a Fortune mineral drill. And we see that more and more, and you probably heard it in the news, that Aboriginal communities wants to be consulted. Technically, land disputes between Aboriginal communities and the government over energy are happening not only in the West, so in British Columbia, Alberta, but also in New Brunswick over fracking. Technically, economic development purpose by non-Aboriginals, such as resources extraction and pipeline activity, require explicit consent from host First Nation on land where they have a land title. Not only their land is a traditional territory, but it's also closely tied to their beliefs and also tied to the culture. So for instance, TransCanada Corp right now has a project of a pipeline that's going to go across 180 different Aboriginal communities. The First Nation have been opposing the project since 2012. It just was accepted with 209 conditions. 209 conditions were opposed on the project because First Nations wanted to protect the Great Bear Rainforest. They were afraid that a spill would actually damage a very fragile ecosystem. There are other examples we can take in Fort McMurray and so forth. So to conclude, oops. Not working. Okay. So to conclude with my presentation, I would say that to ensure a prosperous, sustainable future, actors have to work together. Everyone has to be involved in the decision-making process. I've demonstrated, I think, with the non-renewable project and with the social acceptance issue. Furthermore, I've shown that fossil fuel is not going to disappear today, and the inertia dilemma clearly highlights that renewable energy is not accepted everywhere because of the cost, because of the technology, because of the impact on social beliefs and environment. Meanwhile, we still need to protect the environment. So what I would recommend, and I think we should really invest into better evaluation planning, and we should invest into more social acceptance projects, into environmental impact assessment. We need to have maybe tighter regulations or tighter laws, or we also need to be more transparent and accountable, have citizens participate. If the federal and provincial governments have a big role to play, I do believe that municipalities have a big role to play, but us as well. It's a shared responsibilities, and there are many things we can do in our backyard to actually change the course of the actual greenhouse gases emission. Thank you.
Thanks for your comments, everyone. What we're going to do now is we're going to open the floor for some questions. And if you do want to ask a question, I'm going to ask that you come down. There's 2 mics at the front of the stage so that everyone can hear your question. I'm going to actually start it off because I have a couple of questions to get us started. And if anybody's watching online and you would like to ask a question, you can either do that through the YouTube channel, or you can also ask on our Twitter feed. And that we'll put that up in a moment. But just ask the questions to #TalkEnergy. So I'm going to come over here. And what I wanted to start with, I was just making some notes there as you were going. So you talked about a lot of different very complicated things, right, with energy. So obviously we see that it's not simple. And whether it was coal going from that villain, or from a hero to a villain, or the importance of fossil fuels, and also about the importance of energy for development. but also some examples here for how people are meeting the challenge. I kind of found it seems like this whole climate change, are we fooling ourselves that humanity can actually tackle this challenge? Because from what I'm hearing from both of you is that like there's still a lot of people in the world who need energy, and they're going to get that out of coal. And Eric, you're talking about how important this is for our economy. You gave some examples that give a bit of hope, but I was feeling pretty hopeful after the Paris talks, and I'm wondering if that's maybe misplaced. So I don't know if anyone has any.
I don't think we're doomed, and I think it would be possible to address climate change. I think there is a lot of work we can do at the community level. We tend to forget, and we tend to say, okay, let's look at policy leaders, let's take decision. But we don't necessarily need to wait for those decisions to happen. I would say that 80% of the greenhouse gases emission comes from our communities. So there are little things we can do at the local level to actually tackle climate change and to reduce greenhouse gases emission. There is also maybe another way of thinking. We talk about sustainable development, and we think we need to shift right away to renewable resources. Maybe we can do it the way it is now, but just having tighter regulation and just thinking of it differently. In using the same resources we're using now, how can we make a little difference? We could maybe look at different examples, for instance. We were talking earlier about solar panels. Yeah, it will take a long time to actually see the efficiency of it, but there are great projects happening in the world right now, especially in communities, where people are installing solar panels on their roofs. And also, if you look at Denmark, is a very good example of solar panels farms happening at the community level. So there are great things we can do at the community level. Do not think that climate change cannot be tackled just because of greenhouse gases targets set by political leaders.
Thank you. And I also actually agree that I think there's actually reason to have hope. And I think a big way that we can contribute to climate change is actually looking at, I guess, a lot of the technologies that countries use around the world and try and make that cleaner and more efficient. And I think that's where a lot of the potential is. Like Southeast Asia, for example, they want to have a desire to start burning coal to provide power to their hundreds of thousands of people without it. It's the most efficient, it's the most cost-effective way to do it. But there are technologies that are in progress to make burning that coal more efficient, more friendly towards the environment. So I think a lot of progress can be made there. And I think there's also a lot of opportunity to, I guess, modernize clean technology and apply it to whether it be the oil and gas sector, the natural gas sector, and basically use these new technologies to, again, make them more efficient. And when we say clean technology, again, I think we often jump to something like a windmill or a solar panel, something almost completely renewable. I think that's something that people often think of. But there's also a lot of clean technologies that we can apply to the industries that some people view as dirty when well, I don't necessarily agree with that opinion, but a lot of people may view it that way. And there's a lot of ways we can apply these technologies there and make it more effective and move forward and reduce emissions.
So I have two comments on technology and international relations between developed and developing countries. So first is that remember the simple adage that you need to learn to walk before you can run. So in Southeast Asia, a lot of these new coal power plants are called what is called subcritical technologies. So they're efficient up to 36%. So 36% of the coal that goes in gets turned into energy. But there are better technologies called supercritical technologies that maybe turn 50% of coal into energy. So that's an improvement, right? And so also, I'm originally from BC, and there are 20 proposed LNG projects. So natural gas is sometimes called the transition fuel. And so if all that coal can be replaced with natural gas, that's a huge, that's huge improvement from the environmental perspective. And then, renewable energy. There are lots of cool projects happening. And a second thing that I want to mention is the relationship between technology, developed countries, and developing countries. So what needs to happen is that developed countries need to figure out how to decarbonize their economies and then transfer those technologies to developing countries. And because if tomorrow the developed countries all of a sudden decarbonize completely, we're still not going to meet the 2 degrees Celsius target if the developing countries keep continuing with their trends. So there's, ethical argument, political and economic argument, and I have a really cool number. I love numbers. So the clean tech industry globally is going to be 2.5 trillion class. So there are economic opportunities for Canada to get in there. So I think that whereas, yes, while, we could go Malthusian, but we could also not.
Okay, I'll ask one more question, then we'll open it up. And it's about kind of the responsibility that we have. So I don't know if people in the audience here have heard. So when some of the talks were happening around Paris, there's some people who are saying, as Canadians, we have a small population, and globally in Canada, our emissions of CO2 are under 1% of the global total. So, does it really even matter if Canada does anything? Is it worth us investing into this clean tech when we play such a small part globally? And then I've heard the other argument that actually if you look at each of our emissions, so myself, everybody here in the audience, compared to other people in the world, we have actually one of the highest emissions per person. But because we have such a small population, it still adds up to less than 1%. So just in a couple of words, what do you think our responsibility is as Canadians kind of to the world in this discussion? Is it more important that we use a lot personally, or is it more important that globally we use very little? Anyone?
Maybe I can just start with this question. I think these objectives of helping, developing countries transition into lower carbon economy, and also generating economic growth at home, they're actually compatible. So numbers again. So from 2012 to 2013, clean tech industry, the jobs increased by 21%. That's 9,000 to 50,000 jobs. So it's a growing, it's a very dynamic industry at home. And so for per capita emissions, in 2011, the World Resources Institute said that Canadians, per capita basis, we are the highest greenhouse gas emitting people. So at a 24 ton CO2 equivalent, I think the global average or something, so the global average was 7 ton CO2 equivalent. So I think that we do have a responsibility now, and also historic responsibility for being what's called Western offshoots.
We also have an ethical responsibility, because we know that if we take a decision now and we do act, other countries will follow. You probably heard of the term bandwagoning. In international negotiations at the moment, India and China don't really want to have binding regime, because they're saying, well, you developed countries 100 years ago, you were able to grow because you were actually burning fossil fuel. So now it's our turn. It is a fair argument, honestly, but in today's world, it doesn't work anymore. So we need to set an example and kind of demonstrate how sustainable technologies and how investment into renewable energy can sustain the economy, how it will not prevent us from growing, and especially to increase our GDP. I do believe that we're going to suffer at some point. The Stern report, published 20 years ago, kind of projected that with climate change, GDPs will suffer by 20% to 30%. We want to avoid a decrease of our GDP, because it would be a decrease of our economic growth. So I think we need to change the overall mindset. We can set an example for the world, and we can encourage other countries to invest into renewable energies, just to say, we can still have an economic growth based on renewable energies.
And because you mentioned India and China, China is, since 2013, it's the #1 investor in clean energy technology, and India is right behind there, and Canada is far down there. We're losing our market share, so just want to add that.
You're right, and actually, I don't know if you saw the documentary this week, but There was Naomi Klein's documentary on her latest book. It was about actually the renewable energy investment in China. And you can see in Beijing right now, they have the biggest solar farm in the world. So it's worth checking because there are many things happening, very exciting, innovative projects happening at the international level.
I think I will follow up on that. And while I definitely agree with that sentiment to some degree, I also think that we need to, I guess, approach it with a bit of caution at the same time, because Canada can go out and set an example, but at the same time, Canada is a country of 33 million people, and we can go, and we are a resource-based economy, and while there are certain things that we can do, but we also have to be careful in that we can't go too far and make it and add additional extra costs to our resources that perhaps make them, I guess, less competitive on the world stage, because we might fall out of the economic discussion. For example, if we make it more difficult for our natural resources to be produced and make it more expensive, then economically it just means people won't buy our resources. They will buy a cheaper resource. That being said, I do think there is potential for Canada to take a lot of action. I think where we can make progress is work on research and develop technologies that can be used by other countries, other world leaders across the globe. For example, like Saskatchewan, for example, is doing a ton of great research in clean coal, carbon capture and storage. I know the government of Saskatchewan, for example, they have a clean coal pilot project underway right now, and developing something like that, if they're able to make that succeed, they're able to use that technology and basically tell these like high emitting coal burning countries, be like, hey, use this, it's going to reduce your emissions, you might see the sun again soon, and it'll be great. So I think that's it. And I do think, and then just going back to the original point that I did want to address, in that Canada is one of the highest emitters per capita, and that is a valid point, but at the same time, we also have to keep in mind that we are a northern-based country, and that we have to heat our home for 50% of the year. It's freezing out there sometimes, and a lot of the time it's not windy, it's not sunny, so like we have to heat our homes in some way or another. There is other solutions like hydro, like nuclear, but there's also Saskatchewan, for example, still uses coal. I mean, there's still other areas where we need to, I guess, use high emitting technologies to keep things going. Down the road, I imagine that we can do more to make things better, and I think we do have a duty to that, because we are such a northern economy, we're affected by climate change a lot more than a lot of countries are across the world. So I think there's a duty there. We just have to be careful. I do hope that some change is made in the future. I do hope that we can find these clean technologies that I've been talking about, because I know, for example, I'm very passionate about the outdoors. I'm a proud hunter. I'm a proud angler. I like going outside, and if I choose to have kids one day, I want them to be able to do the same thing. I want them to be able to enjoy that, and I want our environment to stay in good shape. So I hope it's there, but at the same time, I'm always the first to, I guess, look at it with an air of caution.
Okay. So if anyone has any questions or comments, I invite you to come on down and just approach one of the mics. I'll also ask Elizabeth if anybody has tweeted in anything. Okay. Yeah, if you could come right down to the mic, that would help so everyone can hear.
Hello. I'm not sure I got your name, sir. No. Yes.
I'm Eric.
Eric, nice to meet you. I'm kind of curious about some of your numbers that you've brought up. You mentioned the fact that the Canadian, I believe, oil industry in particular has invested $1.2 billion over the last how many years? I'm sorry, was that again? You have it written down?
I don't know if I have the exact years written down on the notes I put together this morning, but anyways.
But it was about that much money compared to some of their other investments. Are you attempting to say that this is a significant contribution to the overall reduction of greenhouse gases through clean energy, or is this like how does this stack up to other investments within green energy overall?
That's a good question. I don't have the numbers on me today in comparing it into so you're talking about how the oil and gas industry, where they're investing in clean technology versus where else they're investing. That I couldn't give you the numbers per se. I know I know that, I mean, they are spending a lot of money in exploration in their own resource development, but I do think that $1.2 billion is a pretty significant number. And I know that the investments are going to keep growing as well. There's a lot of talk about taking additional action on clean technology and clean technology investment moving forward. So I hope that some progress can be made.
If we were to reduce our consumption of energy, we need to make the style in which we live to be less good. You know, we live really well. We have lots of, you know, we use lots of water. We can eat a lot of food. And the way that the economy is stacked up right now, it really prospers from that sort of like overproduction of food. Like we make a lot of food and we can put it all in our supermarkets, and people can buy half the food there and you can throw out the other half, and that's okay. So what I wanted to know is, how do you think we could stack the incentives for people living in Canada today for them to use less resources? Like, what do you think the federal government should get involved into actually increasing or decreasing prices of things so that we buy less stuff and it becomes harder to use what we want? Or do you think that'll completely collapse things and people will want to overthrow the government because they can't do what they want?
So on the question of government intervention, we already have that. So in BC, of carbon tax, so $30 per ton, it's been capped, but they want to increase it. And the Liberal government, they weren't thrown out of the government. And also Quebec has a emissions trading scheme, and Ontario wants to join the Quebec-California emissions trading scheme. So when the economic rationale is that pollution is a negative externality, it's a bad, it harms our health, but doesn't get, that cost isn't included. So pricing carbon comes from that, right? And I think so something you mentioned earlier is that you're living a good life. And I think in a way that is a personal value judgment. It really has to do with how you define a good life. And the last thing that I want to briefly comment on is that so economists are working on right now, they realize that GDP is actually a flawed measure of wealth. It doesn't take into consideration of how healthy your environment is and how happy your people are. And so I believe that at Statistics Canada, they're working on creating, with other international partners, this thing called environmental statistics. So how do we measure, how do we account for the health of our environment, what gets conserved? And so it's pretty exciting.
Even if I work in mostly policy, I do believe that people have a responsibility themselves. I believe in individual empowerment. I think there is a lot of changes to do in terms of mindset. There is a lot of awareness to do as well. I agree with my colleague. It depends on how do we define living well. I think we can live really well in just consuming what we need to consume. We do need to change the lifestyle, but I think it comes from the individual level, most more than the federal level or the provincial level. Would incentives, would sanctions work? I'm not sure, honestly, because if you sanction people all the time, they get annoyed. But also, on the other hand, it doesn't mean they're going to change their behavior. It's not because there is a tax on tobacco that people are going to stop smoking. I think it's the same mindset behind it.
But in BC, from 2008 to 2012, energy consumption decreased by around 19%. So these economic incentives do work. The data shows.
And I guess just to follow up, I just want to say I tend to agree that it is something that should be approached at the individual level. I think there's I think the biggest way that any change is going to be made in that regard is through more public awareness, just encouraging more people to, I guess, live more sustainably. I don't necessarily know if there is a role for government to, I guess, I guess, change prices or intervene in that way, just because it would make things a little bit too difficult. And not only that, I mean, changing the prices of food, for example, I mean, it is a very touchy subject for governments to be tampering with, and food is very expensive at the end of the day. And I know if I was in government, I would not be doing anything to make food more expensive, because I know that I would be kicked out pretty quick. So.
Okay, we'll go with the, thank you. We'll go with the next question. We have a number of people lined up, and it's, we're going to be ending in about 10 minutes, so I'll just ask to keep your responses quite quick so we can get through everybody's questions here.
So you've talked a lot about climate change and the result and how energy consumption affects that, but I'm interested in your opinion about the more secondary effects. For example, how the oil industry has polluted the Athabasca River as an example, and what the oil companies and resource industry is doing to try to prevent that.
There are environmental impact assessment. When I talk about environmental impact assessment, I'm talking about environmental evaluation. So people are consulted, and when they start a project, actually they go see people and say, okay, how can we do this so it doesn't pollute the environment, so it respects your way of life and it doesn't affect your health. I would say it has not been done in Alberta all the time. It has been done, but all the time, or maybe not efficiently enough. Your question was about, so how do we prevent pollution and so forth. Regulations, we need to be as transparent as possible. And if you look at the Environmental Evaluation Commission that was created in Alberta in 2013, it's a great example of how we can improve and prevent water pollution. So right now, the agency is decentralized in the whole province. There is environmental monitoring at 7 levels, where scientists go monitor the pollution, the water quality every single day. They compare the data. So there is work happening here, and I think we can learn a lot from this environmental evaluation monitoring process, maybe to copycat it in other provinces.
And exactly, I agree with that as well. That we have to remember that when, in terms of resource development, when any oil project is done, for example, it is not done without an in-depth environmental assessment process. And for example, in Alberta, when we talk about how we talk about oil sands development, that is a resource development project that is actually almost 100% renewable, because as soon as that comes out of the ground, they can basically come back 50 years later. They're actually mandated to actually reclaim that land 50 years down the road. And I know there's a lot of discussion about how polluting the Athabasca River, because oil and gas development in Canada is a very water-intensive process. But at the same time, all the water that they use is recycled, and if it gets put back into anything, it is 100% clean. The stuff that's going back in there, they can't get away with that anymore. If a company was going to dump something down the Athabasca River, a toxin, I'm sorry, that's just, it can't happen. Like, if they were polluting the Athabasca River to such a high degree, the oil industry in Canada would not be able to function anymore with the way that the political climate is going in Canada. So I hope that answered your questions.
Yeah.
Hi. So the most interesting interplay I saw in the speeches were in one of the speeches we heard about the social apprehension towards actually making changes with regards to the environment, and in another speech we heard quite directly some of the social apprehensions, and that was the entire speech. So sort of Eric, your speech felt a lot like telling people the reasons we should be apprehensive towards change, and in some of your answers you've said you appreciate the environment, but you've put the onus on some future population to actually make the changes themselves, because you hope in the future you'll have the environment to still cherish. So I was just wondering the extent to which you guys all think that we should actually bite the bullet in some ways today to make that change and stop putting it off to some hypothetical future that may or may not happen.
And I think I should make an important distinction here, in that I'm not necessarily saying that we need to push things off towards the future. I'm just saying that I think our efforts are best spent looking at doing what we do now and doing it better. So like I said, I keep going back to something like clean technology and looking at things like that. We rely so much on the natural resource industry, so much on the energy industry, and I think there is definitely opportunity for us to look at that and say, okay, we can do this cleaner, we can do this more effective, and I think that is something that can be done now. It's something that can be done soon, and there's a big push in the industry to do that right now as well. I know in the past couple weeks, or in the past couple months, almost every major oil and gas company in Canada has actually released their climate change strategy. If you look at Suncor, if you look at Imperial, if you look at a number of them, they're taking action right now and they're moving forward on it, and it is a priority. What I've just said is that we need to be careful and not go too far and hurt ourselves in the process.
I agree with you. Change must happen at some point, yes. However, we do have limitations in terms of cost and in terms of technology. Right now, even if we're using windmills, we're still limited because you need the wind and we don't have the battery to store that wind. So you would actually be producing energy as much as the windmill can, but you need the wind for that. And it's the same problem with solar. So I would say, yes, we should make a change, but we are limited cost-wise and technology-wise. And the time we try to spend into innovation, it will take few years. I think carbon storage won't come out before maybe 2020, if it's not 2025. If we install this carbon storage, as I was saying in my presentation, by 2020, we'll still take 2 decades or maybe 1 decade if we go fast to make a significant change. So change will not occur today, but I do believe we need to start somewhere, and the somewhere is now.
And actually, so if CCS gets implemented and the cost of renewable energy keeps going down at current speed, coal can't compete with renewable energy because the cost is just not going to be as stable. And so that brings me to, I want to make a number of remarks. First is that, yes, the interplay that you diplomatically mentioned, I also wanted to say that sometimes, Eric, I felt like you create a false dichotomy in saying that when you refer to resources, you refer to oil and gas, but water and geothermal energy, that's Canadian resources too, right? And I think it's really important for us to say that, well, it's not either or, but it's both and, especially for Canada. So for example, so take example of South Korea. South Korea imports 97% of its resources, and it's all about decarbonizing its economy because it means less resource dependency. But Canada is different, right? So we need a different approach, and we need a less polarizing vision for a country, I think. And the last thing I want to say is that the past isn't necessarily the best predictor of the future, right? So the technological constraints and limitations that we have now may not be the same in the future, right? And that's the whole idea with Malthus not being able to predict industrial revolution. And statistically speaking, we can't predict the future. So I think that gives a reason to be optimistic and the need to be optimistic.
All right, so we've got a question that was sent in by YouTube here. So it says, although our energy industry is still very valuable, and we consider it to be a realistic source to provide us with energy today, is the negative perception and propaganda of the industry not critical to the shift towards more clean sources? We have to stop promoting the energy industry today to jump to clean sources instead.
And I guess that goes back to what I was saying earlier, that sure we can go ahead and promote the shift to clean sources, and we can do that all we want, but again, it's not something that's going to happen overnight. It's not something the technology is not there yet. Perhaps it's something we can strive towards and move towards, and we can make investments toward and take steps towards getting there down the road. But it's not something we can go ahead and just say, yeah, we're getting rid of this all right now, and we're going to move completely to this, because again, it can't happen. We don't have the technology yet to do it.
Hi, so I think that the Let's Talk Energy initiative is really cool and important, and so I had a couple questions about that. I was just wondering who's funding the Let's Talk Energy initiative, and if it's just completely the Canadian government, and also I was a little bit curious about the logo and if it's connected to energy in any way.
I can answer that question since this is a museum initiative. We started it back in 2010, and we realized that energy was pretty crucial to everything we did as a museum of science and technology. So like we talked about that industrial revolution, kind of talked about that. So all of the different things that we collect when we're looking at transportation or communication or appliances and how Canadians live all has a root in energy. Canada also has a lot of really important energy firsts. So we're really involved in the development of a lot of nuclear technologies and hydro technologies and also technologies involved in oil and gas. So we thought we had a good story to tell there, but also that energy is there's a lot of different opinions about it. And we found that there was a lot of misinformation. So we wanted to be able to offer a bit of a neutral voice and present some facts, and wanted to be able to do things like this where people could talk a bit more and learn without being so kind of polarized or attacking, which is what you see a lot in the media. In terms of who we're sponsored by, we have a number of different sponsors. You can see them on our website. We are mostly sponsored by energy industry. So we put money in, obviously, as the museum, but we also have people from oil, from gas, from nuclear. We've had wind people also invest in this. And we have an advisory committee of people who are from all different energy sectors, as well as environmental, economics, and academia. But we have the program is controlled by the museum, but we have asked for support from lots of different partners.
All right, thank you.
Thanks.
Hello. So my question to you is, when this forum has talked mostly on like the economy of energy and has kind of said why we should delay like turning to completely clean energy, even if it takes a few years and it's not like cold turkey right away, won't we be hurt in the future when the environment comes back to bite us, especially for Canada, which has an economy that is based a ton on like forest and the likes, if we don't make that shift as soon as possible, and if we don't put all of our forces towards making that shift right now instead of delaying until like the future when we might get technologies that could help?
It's a good question. We're already very hurt in the sense that the greenhouse gases emission right now are the result of 100 years ago, so the Industrial Revolution. So it means that we have 100 years to kind of go through before maybe we get to 2015, 16 greenhouse gases emission. So even if we make changes now, what tells us that the greenhouse gases emissions are actually going to go down, and how much they're going to go down, and how is it going to be efficient to actually reach the 2 degrees that we kind of need to not change so much the ecosystem and to not affect individual habitats. So I mean, I hear you, but even if we do the change now, I'm not sure it will affect immediately the greenhouse gases reduction in the short term.
And I think if I understood you correctly, you are alluding to the need to diversify economy, right?
Like partly, yes.
Yes, and I think that the loonie, trading at what is it, like 70 cents US dollar, that's hurting our economy in general. And that's because our foreign exchange from the US is earned mostly by crude oil, and 97% of our crude oil goes to the US. So we're dependent on a single market, and we're dependent on the single commodity to earn our foreign exchange from the US. And that goes against the theories of good economic principles, and you need to diversify. And I think it's something important to remember if we don't want to pay $13 for, cauliflower, because our dollar is so low. Yeah.
We'll take these 2 questions.
Okay.
Do you have a follow-up?
No, that's great. Thank you.
Okay, hi. So in 2006, Stephen Harper claimed multiple times that Canada was an energy superpower, specifically citing the oil sands and the vast proven reserves in Alberta. But now with the kind of changing political attitude, specifically after Paris, where there was an obvious sort of attitude and pressure to change, to find more renewable sources to really meet these targets, the 2 degrees, famous 2 degrees target. So I guess my question is, how is Canada as an energy superpower now? Are we an energy superpower, and what does this term mean today or for the future? And is it kind of, as Trudeau mentioned in Switzerland, more about resourcefulness than resources? And really, how do we stand and how do we kind of what is our status moving on in the future?
Really good question. Okay. I'm trying to gather my thoughts together. In terms of superpower, today, yes, it seems irrelevant because we are shifting our vision of what the future of Canada in terms of energy is going to be. It doesn't mean that we're still not a superpower in terms of like the energy we have with the resources we have available in the ground. So in terms of like capacity, we still are. However, in terms of what we will be offering, not so much anymore in terms of the value we kind of get back. So yes, I agree with this on this point. We still have maybe the capacity to be this energy superpower in the sense that we do give still a lot of electricity to the United States, for instance. They rely on our energy. Quebec has been giving, even for free sometime, a lot of hydroelectricity to Michigan State. So in that sense, I would say we're still quite an important player in the world because we're able to provide electricity to the United States. We need to diversify our markets as well. I mean, there are other countries other than China right now who might need our energy. We have solely, I would say, sustained on China and the world to say, okay, there is a need there is a demand. So let's target China as a major recipient of our oil and gas. There are other places who need that gas, and so maybe we need to look at to diversify worldwide our market. So there's still a potential for Canada to be, a superpower. Then there is the aspect of renewable energy. If we invest in cards and innovations are play really well at the political level, there is still a potential for Canada to be a model in terms of superpower, not so much in terms of hard power, but maybe in terms of soft power. Having countries looking at us as an image, looking at us as a leader in renewable resources, I think in that case we would be a soft power, but superpower.
I guess I'll just follow up on that. And I guess I'll start by saying thank you all very much for putting us on our toes today. These have been some really tough questions. So I've had a lot of fun up here under the bright lights answering them. So I think I'll start by saying the whole dialogue around the energy superpower. I think saying something like that, I think there is a lot of posturing when you're saying that, just the whole superpower dialogue. So I don't know how much value that is. I think a lot of it is just semantics. But that being said, I do think that our energy industry itself, and specifically our oil and gas industry, still does have a significant amount of potential in Canada, despite a lot of comments that are being made about it right now, because again, it is something that we are using daily. And not only that, Canada has I believe it's the third largest oil reserve in the world, if I remember correctly, if my numbers are right. And yet, even then, even though we have these oil reserves, we're still importing oil, and we're still importing oil from a lot of countries like Saudi Arabia, Iran, all across the Middle East. A lot of these countries that are known for a lot of different human rights abuses, doing a lot of different things in their countries, whereas Canada, we know exactly where our oil and gas is coming from, and we actually know how it's being produced and how, I guess, its impact on the environment. And there's actually control over what we're doing with our industry. So I think we have a lot more potential to actually use it and embrace it as our own and to rely on it a bit more, because again, a lot of energy in Canada, a lot of oil and gas in Canada that's used right now, like I said, it was imported, and a lot of these countries that are selling it to us, they don't care about climate change. It's not on their agenda at all. Not on their agenda at all. They'll just keep pumping it out as fast as possible. So at least with Canadian oil, with Canadian energy, we're getting it from a respectable, reliable, and environmentally conscious source.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. We'll take this last question.
Hello. My question is about the Paris conference, and I was going to ask, what are your thoughts on Canada's promises at the Paris conference, and how do you think Canadians nowadays can impact the environment and the economy due to those promises?
Well, it was kind of a tricky moment for Canada because the government was newly elected. They didn't have targets set, and they really wanted to consult with provinces. So they came up with this idea of sticking to the 1.5 degrees Celsius target. Also, they were thinking of just keeping the targets that were proposed by the previous government, which were at the Copenhagen conference, 30% under 2005 levels by 2020, or maybe 2030, sorry if I'm not being accurate here. We didn't have much choice going there. I think we need to give this to the government. We can do better. We can maybe consult a lot more with provinces and see what's visible. So the conference of the parties in Paris came up at a very bad moment for Canada. This being said, there is a lot we can do, and I think the first move was to change the name of Environment Canada and just name Environment Canada in Climate Change Ministry. So it shows that there is some sort of leadership, and I think where there is leadership, there is possible change. So in that matter, I think the government is sending very good signals at the moment. I would recommend, and I would argue that the federal government really needs to work with the federal level, yes, of course, but the provincial level and also the municipalities. There is a lot of innovation happening at the municipal level right now, and I was talking about the Partners for Climate Protection. There are great energy planning coming out of municipalities because they're working together, sharing knowledge, sharing policy tools, and if everybody is able to work together and look at what has been done so far and what's projected to be done, we can move forward pretty quickly having those actors at the table.
And it was 90 days after going back from Paris that Trudeau, I think Prime Minister Trudeau promised a national target. Was it? And March 5th in Vancouver, they're meeting and they're going to be talking about coming up with a pan-Canadian plan for a plan or framework. It may be a target to follow up from the COP21. And something that you also mentioned about the role of individual Canadians, I think it's huge because, the public opinion polls. I work for a positive energy project at University of Ottawa. We conducted, the project commissioned a public opinions poll to Nanos Research and found out that 71% of Canadians actually support renewable energy. And about 40% said that they would feel more comfortable with supporting oil and gas projects if Canada had stronger climate change policies. So they're compatible, right? And so I think I'm rambling a little bit, but what I want to say is that having these kinds of dialogues and having forming thoughts based on evidence is really important in going ahead and creating a more prosperous Canadian energy future.
Just a quick add to what I said. I think we also need to look at the comprehensive national energy plan, because right now everybody has plans and projects at the local level, at the provincial level. Provinces are kind of working together, mostly Quebec and Ontario are working together. But I think there is real need to sit down and start working on a national energy comprehensive plan, and we can move forward together as a country and not so much as single actors and free riders.
And I think my colleagues discussed the conversations at COP quite in depth, so I don't necessarily want to go in depth there, but I guess I wanted to go back to your comments about what we can do at the individual level. And I certainly think there is a lot that we can do, and I think there is so much opportunity for you guys to get involved, to volunteer, to get involved with organizations perhaps that do things for environmental causes that you care about, maybe adopt more sustainable practices. Or for myself, for example, believe it or not, I also do volunteer work for an environmental conservation organization in my spare time. I'm organizing a big fundraising dinner tomorrow night for it because it is something that I'm passionate about. I mean, you might not guess that with a lot of what I said today, because I think I've portrayed myself as a raw oil and gas kind of guy, which I am. But at the same time, I do care. I do care about the environment. So it is something that I'm passionate about, and I think for you guys on the individual level, I think there is certainly a significant amount of opportunity for you guys to get involved, for you to take action, and for you to do things that you think might make a difference.
Yeah. And I know that working on this Let's Talk Energy project, obviously a big challenge is going to be climate, and so this is going to be something that we're all going to be dealing with probably for the next 20, 30, 50 years. And I think it's going to be a long-term goal. It's going to be kind of like humanity's next big project, is how we tackle this challenge to provide energy for people all over the world that need it for their well-being, their livelihoods, but we do it in a way that we can, you know, maintain the environment and the health of the planet. So I think it's going to be a big challenge. I'm going to stop it at this point. We're going over time, so I'd just like to thank our three speakers for joining us today and taking time out of their schedules. I'd also like to thank everyone who joined us online, and I'd especially like to thank the students and the teachers who've come from Gloucester, from Lisgar, and from Colonel By, and made the effort. I know it's a snowy, rainy, icy day out there, so thanks a lot for coming and thanks for your questions.